person who wasn't going to express their emotions openly, but at the same time he was a very emotional person and a very thoughtful person. And I think it was these two elements pulling against each other which informed a lot of his writing, and he expressed his frustration and his emotional side in the poetry, which he didn't express in real life. So, like all of us, he wasn't a perfect person, and he expressed a lot of his darker side in his poetry as well. So that's really interesting. He was sort of one thing in public life and then another thing in his writing. And I think it's also interesting to explore his poems which deal with things that don't go right and frustrations in your life. And he expressed all these in a very pithy sort of way as well, which adds to the allure of his poetry. So I'm going to read two of his poems. The first one is the one I mentioned about work. It was written in 1954, and it's about the idea that we can all relate to, which is the idea that work takes over your life. You have to spend so much of your life working, going to work every day, and you think of all the things that you could be doing if you weren't at work and if you didn't have to have a job. And it's very frustrating, and there's a feeling of unfulfilled ambition, and the idea that there's a tyranny there, that you have to work every day, perhaps in a job that you don't particularly like. And he expressed this in this poem, and the poem is called Toads. And the metaphor is that work is like a big toad which is just there in your life all the time. This horrible thing which you have to do and you have to deal with. But it also expresses part of Larkin's bitterness, because he describes other people who don't need to work and they get by doing other things, and he's bitter and frustrated because he can't seem to do that. He hasn't got the wit, or he doesn't feel that he's able to get by like that, like other people do. He needs the safety and the security of a steady job. So it's, on the one hand, it's kind of an admiration for people who can live in a more transient way, but at the same time it's got a lot of bitterness in it, and that's interesting. And it's, like I said, it's something we can all relate to, that a lot of the time we don't enjoy our jobs. So I'm gonna read it now. outrageous enough to shout stuff your pension, but I know all too well that's the stuff that dreams are made on. For something sufficiently toad-like squats in me too. Its hunkers are heavy as hard luck and cold as snow, and will never allow me to blarney my way to getting the fame and the girl and the money all in one sitting. I don't say one body's the other, one spiritual truth, but I do say it's hard to lose either when you have both. Okay, so the second poem is one of his most well-known, and it's called The Whitsun Weddings. It's not as bitter as the first one, it's quite positive, and it's got a little bit of kind of wistfulness about it, which is nice. And it's really beautiful. It's all about a train journey that he took one day. It was written in 1958, and he was on a train, and they stopped off at a stop somewhere, and lots of newly married couples got on the train to go into London. And it's just about the few minutes that all these newly married couples were on this train, along with all other passengers. And it's about how they all shared this one moment at the beginning of their marriages. And then when the train arrived at the destination, everybody went their separate ways, and it's just about this one moment in time, and about how it was just frozen there for a second, and then it was gone. And it's got really lovely descriptions about the different people and how they're all reacting to everything, and he's kind of an observer, but he's also sharing a little bit in their joy as well. So it's a more positive poem than the first one, and it beautifully captures just a moment in time. But it's interesting because it also contains a lot of contrasting imagery, this imagery of kind of industrial towns, and then it's juxtaposed with other more beautiful imagery, so it's as if this one moment is something beautiful in amongst a very industrial, very everyday context. So it's, again, like Larkin himself, it's got both sides of life. It's got the beauty, but then it's also got the dull, everyday, and the functional, and the unattractive elements. So it kind of sums him up really, and it is one of his most well-known poems. So here it is, The Whitsun Weddings. That Whitsun I was late getting away, not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my 3/4 empty train pull out, all windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock, thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short-shadowed cattle, and canals with floatings of industrial fathers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and jewellery substitutes, the lemons, mauves and olive ochres that marked off the girls unreally from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards and bunting-dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days were coming to an end. All down the line, fresh couples climbed aboard, the rest stood round, the last confetti and advice were thrown, and as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull. Fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. The women shared the secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Free at last and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, "I nearly died," a dozen marriages got underway. They watched the landscape sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl, and none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed, and as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close, and it was nearly done, this frail travelling coincidence, and what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight somewhere